his question. I think we've got a doctor in the audience. You say bankers have institutional conformity, but are not the government institutions also along for the ride until something goes wrong? Does that make sense? That question. Hang on.
That is a good question.
If you know what? If you can see these patterns, why can't we legislate before rather than after? That's interesting. So,
well, this is something, as I said, when I traced back to the history of financial crises, one of the patterns that I was referring to was the pattern that regulation often follows crises. Good times come back, economies flourish, and what happens? The politicians who are responsible for legislation, in their pursuit of popularity, tend, especially if they're on the right side and want to garner support from the business community, and which includes the finance community, have a tendency to repeal restrictive regulations. Now, we've seen this time and time again. Let's look at the Great Depression and the Glass-Steagall Act that was brought in 1933. It took 70 years for that piece of regulation that prevented banks and investment banks from co-forming into one entity. So a traditional bank would then undertake much riskier business that an investment bank would undertake. It took 70 years for that to be repealed back in 1999. I trace that as one of the key factors leading into the GFC. Now, what happened after the GFC in 2010?
Sorry, what was Glass-Steagall?
Glass-Steagall was the regulation that prevented banks merging with investment banks, because banks are sacrosanct. They hold deposits of mums and dads. The last thing a government wants is for a bank to go bankrupt. But if they were to merge with an investment bank, they actually increase the risk profile of the combined institution, and that's what that contributed to the Great Depression when those merged entities failed. That was repealed in 1999 with the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, which we could see this coming. That meant that banks like Citibank could now undertake investment banking activities and risk up their business. What happened after the GFC? We had quite a good regulatory framework called the Dodd-Frank Act. Now it took 7 years for Trump to repeal a major portion of the Dodd-Frank Act over two separate pieces of regulation that repealed those essential provisions that required banks to be stress tested to report on certain risks. That repeal still exists. So the lesson that I learned, and in answering that question, what I fear is this pendulum effect, this shifting nature of power between industry, between the finance industry and between legislators. And this shifts after every crisis and before every crisis.